It is such a pleasure to have you here at our Congressional Neuroscience Caucus briefing, hosted by the American Brain Coalition and our partners. Those partners are American College of Neuropharmacology, the Dana Foundation, IEEE Brain, the Kavli Foundation, Simons Foundation, the Society for Neuroscience, and the Society for Biological Psychiatry. We appreciate those sponsors helping us put this event together. My name is Jennifer French. I'm the board chair of the American Brain Coalition and also the co-founder and executive director of Neurotech Network. 28 years ago, I had a spinal cord injury that left me paralyzed. 27 of those 28 years, I've been living with an experimental implanted neurostimulation device that allows me to use my paralyzed limbs, but also helps me to combat the life-threatening secondary conditions that come along with spinal cord injury. That technology I use every day, and I'm grateful for it, and I'm grateful for the research that made it happen. However, that technology was never translated out. So the people who only have access to that technology are people who were in the clinical trial. So the investments made in neurotechnology research have changed my life dramatically. But what we need to understand is that the research is wonderful, but we also need the ecosystem to make those technologies have impact on people and on society. And what we need is commercial entities to pick up that technology and bring it into clinical adoption to make it available for people like you and me. And it's not just research, it's our whole ecosystem. It's the researchers, it's the clinicians, it's the investors, it's industry. So it's this whole ecosystem that helps with translation of technology from discovery to adoption to society impact. But what we also are facing is this plethora of neurological conditions, everything from Alzheimer's to depression to stroke to spinal cord injury. And all of those conditions need a wide variety of technologies to be available to find that solution. And those technology solutions are grounded in American innovation. And those innovations will help change the way that we treat Americans with conditions today. I have never been so excited to see the technologies that are being developed now and in translation. And I'm truly excited to feature some of those technologies here for you today so you can see them and understand their journey. But first, we would like to introduce our sponsors for the Congressional Neuroscience Caucus. We are very honored to have Congressman Morgan Luttrell with us today. Would you like to say a few words?
Love to. It is afternoon. Good afternoon. This is actually going to be this is going to be the best part of my day. So if you're recording this, send it out to the masses. We're going to go after this. Probably not going to be as much fun. It's great to see so many familiar faces. And when I walked into the door, I'm usually always amazed at the technology that is presented to me from the time that I step on the blue carpet to the time I'm standing here in front of you. And my ask is that you continue to push the envelope of innovation when it comes to neuroscience and understanding of brain, the human brain, that last bastion of uncharted frontier that we so desperately want the answers to. Ms. French, you said it very well, and I say it, have said it, and continue to say it every time I'm in front of you, that it's a shame how siloed we are when we have technology that is very available. Where's my Medtronics rep at? Where'd you go? There you go. I got a Medtronics device in me, and I've had it in me for well over a decade, and it has absolutely been a life-changing technology that allows me to kind of function day to day. And I don't really know where I would be without that. So thank you, and I'm not throwing you a shout out, Medtronic, but I just happen to be the one that's inside me, so we're good to go. When we have industry and when we have science, technology, institutes of higher learning, and these brilliant minds, and you mentioned it, these cross-functional teams that we either need to create or moderately created, but the coming together of the infinite whole is how we will create the trajectory that we need to save lives, to give you back the abilities that you lost, to, if you have a stroke, it's not, because the way we understand now, if you have a severe stroke, that's it. And if you're unfortunate or fortunate enough to survive a severe stroke, the family, the inner circle, the primary, secondary, ring of effect will surround you, and then that will be the way of life forever. If technology advances itself in a way that gives that human being or that man or woman the ability to regain function from pre-stroke baseline or beyond, how amazing would that be? And I'll tell you right now, as a legislator and someone who has to deal with some pretty interesting people that aren't in the room with us, as hard and as aggressive as you're pushing your technology, I can assure you, someone's going to push back. Someone will not want you to solve a problem. And I hate to say that, but you need to hear it if you haven't yet. I tell you to continue to shove, and I continue to tell you to break out a sledgehammer if you need to. My time in Washington, D.C. as a member of Congress will be coming to an end in January. I'm retiring. And I've always said, and I'll continue to say this until I go through the finish line, that I am that open door representative that will be the voice in this place to get you what you're asking for. And as many times as I've said that, ladies and gentlemen, I'm pleasantly unsurprised how many people walk in my door. You have access to provide information that can be shared with members like myself and across this town that can change lives in a heartbeat. You just have to share that information. And when I say that, not with each other. One thing I learned in grad school was like, it's so amazing to hang something on the wall and put something on a shelf. And it goes nowhere if that's the case. Be loud. Be proud of what we're doing. You should be. You've worked hard for it. And by all means, I don't know how many PhDs are in this room, but I know how hard that is to get. Share that with the rest of the world. Okay? Fair enough? Fair enough. That's my soapbox for the day. But I am so proud, to be a chair of not only this caucus, but just, I like to consider myself a representative of what you're trying to do here, so I can help share that information. So you guys enjoy the day. Don't stay in Washington, D.C. too long. And if you get in trouble, I'm not that hard to find. Fair enough? Fair enough. All right, cool. Here we go.
Thank you, Congressman Luttrell. Our other co-chair, Mike Thompson, was unfortunately not able to attend today, but one of his staff representatives is here, Tyler Adams. Tyler, please come up.
Hi everyone. My boss apologizes for not being able to make it today, but sent me along with a short statement on his behalf just to thank everybody for the great work in putting this together. So, dear friends, I wish I could be with you in person today. Thank you, American Brain Coalition, American College of Neuropsychopharmacology, Dana Foundation, IEEE Brain, Kavli Foundation, Simons Foundation, Society for Neuroscience, and Society of Biological Psychiatry for your partnership with the Congressional Neuroscience Caucus to host today's briefing. Mental health represents one of the most difficult challenges we face as a country. 1 in 5 Americans live with mental illness, yet there's still so much we don't know about the human brain and how to treat it. Qualified and experienced mental health researchers often lack the resources to conduct large-scale transformative studies. That's what makes the Brain Initiative's work so critical. The innovative tools and technologies emerging from the Brain Initiative are driving groundbreaking discoveries across NIH institutes and reinforcing our country's leadership in medical research. The Brain Initiative is a great example of how public-private partnership can accelerate our research to alleviate mental illness and disease. This kind of work is exactly why I joined the Congressional Neuroscience Caucus as a co-chair with Representative Luttrell. I look forward to continuing the caucus's work with each of you to support critical research and ensure that the United States remains a leader in scientific breakthroughs, economic growth, and patient benefits. Sincerely, Mike Thompson.
Thank you.
It's a great discussion.
Great, thank you for coming, Tyler. We want to thank our co-chairs for their continued leadership and support for the Brain Initiative. So with that, we're also very privileged and thrilled today to have Dr. Nick Spitzer with us from the Society for Neuroscience. He will come up and say a few words, but just wanted to mention that the Society for Neuroscience was having their council meeting here over the last few days here in DC, and we are so privileged to have some of the council members here with us today, and so we appreciate the partnership that the Society for Neuroscience has had with the American Brain Coalition over the years, and for the brain advocacy that you've been doing. Dr. Spitzer.
Thank you, Jen. It's a real pleasure to be here. Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Nick Spitzer, professor of neurobiology at the University of California in San Diego. I'm also privileged to be serving as the current president of the Society for Neuroscience. SFN is the world's largest organization of scientists and physicians dedicated to understanding the brain and the central nervous system. We represent more than 30,000 members in over 95 countries around the world, a truly global society. Our member scientists have brought forward many groundbreaking discoveries, improving the lives of people with debilitating conditions of the brain and nervous system. Importantly, so many of these discoveries have been powered by federal investment in the National Institutes of Health and the NIH Brain Initiative. Thanks to the continued bipartisan support in Congress, just illustrated here with the partnership between Representatives Luttrell and Thompson, the continued bipartisan support for biomedical research, the U.S. has remained at the forefront of scientific advances in neuroscience. We are grateful for the Congress investment in the science and for the leadership of the Congressional Neuroscience Caucus in supporting the Brain Initiative here on Capitol Hill through many efforts, including hosting briefings such as today's. I also want to thank Jen and the American Brain Coalition for convening the briefing today, as well as engaging relevant stakeholders year-round. SFN is proud to be a founding member of ABC and to work closely with the coalition to advance policies and investments that support scientists across the country and ultimately individuals and families who are impacted by brain conditions that with research we can one day cure. To get there, we urge Congress to prioritize the continuation of the transformative efforts supported by the Brain Initiative. We look forward to working closely with Congress to ensure a successful future for this program. Thank you, and I'll turn things over to NIH Brain Initiative Director, John Nye.
That one. Thanks very much. Appreciate you all being here. It's been a real privilege to be able to talk to many of you over the years about this thing we call the Brain Initiative. I joined the NIH almost exactly 6 years ago. Before that, for 27 years, I was a goofball professor at the University of California, Berkeley. And Walter Korschitz, my former boss, said, well, why wouldn't you want to take this job? It's the best job in neuroscience. And Walter was right. It really has been amazing to see and to be part of this revolution in neuroscience, creating the tools that will revolutionize our understanding of this incredible organ, 86 billion neurons plus others. Some of the things that Brain has been doing has been driving discovery through generating large resources. Our investigators have generated comprehensive cell atlases, the parts list of model system brains as well as the human brain. We're developing the tools to figure out the wiring diagram, the connectivity diagram, to understand how these components talk to each other so that we can understand the source code for all of our thoughts, our emotions, our actions. And then we're also developing tools to intervene, to access these specific cell types as a way of not only understanding how circuits work in health and models of disease, but also ultimately for precision molecular therapies for these devastating human brain disorders, which can be accounted for in 1 in 3 humans on the planet. That's over 100 million people in the US, exacting an economic toll beyond the societal and personal tolls of about $1.3 trillion a year. So the need is urgent, but the opportunities are huge to solve it. So we're not only developing these tools to accelerate future cures and treatments, but I think as you're going to hear about today from this great panel of scientists and engineers, we're actually helping people today. The technologies, the hopes that I thought when I came into this were kind of maybe in our children's or our grandchildren's lifetime, I think will be in our own lifetime because of this great acceleration of knowledge, resourcefulness, as well as ingenuity. So we're going to hear from some leading academics, entrepreneurs, industry veterans. Doug, I'm counting you as an industry veteran, by the way, about what it takes to overcome the barriers to go from discovery to the initial design through early trials, through FDA approval, and actually getting it out into people. We're going to see the entire spectrum of this discovery and engineering process. So starting at the end here, Michael Mager, he is the co-founder and CEO of Precision Neuroscience, a startup neurotech company developing implantable brain-computer interface technologies. And next to him is Doug Weber, has the Akhtar and Bhutta Endowed Professorship at the Carnegie Mellon University, and is the co-founder of Reach Neuro. And that company is developing spinal cord stimulation for stroke rehabilitation. And the next is Jacob Robinson, who's a professor at Rice University and co-founder and CEO of Motif Neurotech. You'll understand why they're calling it Motif in a moment. And they're developing a new minimally invasive brain interface for the treatment of major depressive disorder. And then the true industry veteran, Rob Rake, who's director of neuromodulation research and technology at Medtronic, a strategic medical device manufacturer, who I think you're going to learn about today, has been a critical partner in getting a lot of these technologies going, from early idea to into the clinic. And then Dr. Helen Bronte-Stewart, who is the John Cahill Professor at Stanford University School of Medicine and founder of QDG Health. And Helen has been a pioneer in understanding the basis of movement disorders, but also in terms of developing the technologies for treating them. So just starting with you, Helen, could you just explain to folks so we can all understand what is deep brain stimulation and what is this adaptive deep brain stimulation that you and your team developed from early concept and in partnership with Medtronic, got it through FDA approval, which we just received last year, so there's helping thousands, if not tens of thousands of people in need.
Yeah, thank you. I refer to deep brain stimulation as a brain pacemaker, and I think that makes it easy for people to understand. We all know about cardiac pacemakers. They basically stimulate the heart and they control electrical rhythms in the heart. Deep brain stimulation means we're implanting chronic stimulating electrodes in these deep structures in the brain, which is where the brain conveniently converges all the sensory motor signals in what we call the sensory motor network. And so that's why it's called deep brain stimulation. One of the things that I think is really important, which fueled my research career, and I've been working on in this wonderful partnership with academia, industry, the NIH, especially the Brain Initiative and the FDA, is how do we understand what brain signals are relative to movement problems in people with, say, Parkinson's disease? And then how can we translate this brain pacemaker to be something closer to what a cardiac pacemaker is? Because believe it or not, when I first went to visit Medtronic, they give you this wonderful pamphlet, and in it you see the very early days of cardiac stimulation, where there were literally these wires put through your sternum. It's embarrassing to sort of say that in the brain pacemaker world for decades, we've been just putting wires in the brain and stimulating without sensing what the brain is actually telling us. So what we needed to do is we needed to understand what brain signals were relevant to these abnormal movements, because if you use the wrong cardiac signal to stimulate a heart, you could kill someone. Same thing in the brain, you could really make them worse. So a lot of my work was combining the computerized measures of movement that I developed in my lab with recording with brain signals that we recorded off Medtronic's first implanted sensing device. And then we could actually develop algorithms to use those signals to now drive the pacemaker itself. And that was really a 10 to 12 year process that then ultimately we published some small single center studies along with some other groups in actually doing the first closed loop studies working with the Medtronic investigative devices. And that led to enough data for Medtronic to then think, well, maybe now we can do the pivotal trial. So I was fortunate enough to work with them to design and then run the study that we ran from about 2020 to 2024, and in which yielded FDA approval, so that all this work that we'd done over the last 10 to 12 years is finally now a therapy that everyone who has a sensing device can have.
Thanks, Helen. That's a great description of it. But so you also mentioned that you worked with Medtronic, so we'd like to turn to Rob. Rob, you're with a company called Medtronic. Maybe for people in the audience that are not familiar with the company, you can describe it for us. But also, what led a large company like Medtronic to look for partners in academia and academic research like Helen, and to work with them on the journey of bringing a new technology forward, particularly for people living with Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, thank you. So I work for Medtronic. It's the world's largest medical device company. We've got about 100,000 employees. We serve patients in about 150 countries. All the kinds of medical devices you can imagine, Medtronic is involved in those markets. We were founded by Earl Bakken, who created the world's first pacemaker. And as Helen said, that evolved into closed loop pacing, right? As she said, where we're listening to the heart and responding with the stimulation as and how the patient needs it. Medtronic also founded the neuromodulation market, which is electrical stimulation and delivery of other energies for treating things like Parkinson's, chronic pain, et cetera. But up until recently, this has been in the open loop, right? Just providing the therapy without listening to the nervous system. So we had some engineers before my time that were critical in the sensing portion of the cardiac space who came over to neuromodulation and said, well, why can't we do that in the brain? Well, one of the biggest challenges was an engineering challenge of actually recording these very, very small brain signals. They're about 1 million times smaller than the energies we're injecting into the tissue to drive therapy. So there was a really big engineering challenge that started about 20 years ago. So as they started working that out in the lab and in animals, there's a crucial jump that you need to take and take it into the clinic to really translate. And so it was really fortunate for us at the time that the Brain Initiative started right when we were ready to do so. And this is where we needed curious and vigorous investigators to partner with us, and really at a high-risk research. We didn't know if it was going to work. Kind of fast forward now, we have platforms in chronic pain and deep brain stimulation. We have these devices in tens of thousands of patients worldwide, and we have a commercialized approved therapy that's adaptive DBS. So that listens to the brain in Parkinson's patients and gives them the right amount of stimulation when they need it and how they need it. And so with Helen and a lot of the other NIH investigators, we are able to work out a lot of foundational questions around this technology. It's one thing to do something in an animal, it's another thing to do it in a few patients, but we had in Parkinson's 10 different centers looking at this. There's different treatment paradigms. This is in the real world. Everybody experiences their disease a little bit different. They get slightly different treatments. So this was really critical for us to get confidence and to move forward to that pivotal trial, as Helen said.
Great, thanks. We're going to come back to this issue of what it took to get your board to go along with this, because it was, of course, a risk. So we've heard about this critical public-private partnership. This would not have happened without the brilliant investigators that we fund in the academic institutions, but also the willingness of industry to provide the initial experimental devices and then actually to take it over the finish line. But there's a different model, right? This is the United States of America. We're entrepreneurial. And so Jacob was one of these entrepreneurs who developed something really cool in the lab and say, I got a great idea. If I commercialize it, it can help a lot of people. So Jacob, tell us about the story about Motif. You got one of those devices too. And I think the flip side of that is, what does it take for you to think, I'm going to take this risk, set this thing up, go out for funding, not just writing grants, which you do have, by the way, right?
Yes.
And then, the parallel question is, Rob probably had to convince his board, but you have to convince investors. So tell us about your journey. And it's a nice contrast to this other model.
I also had to convince my wife, which was equally hard. So maybe I'll tell you what we're building, and then I'll tell you kind of how we got there in my own weird way. So this is the device that John was talking about. He said to bring something impressive, and unfortunately our device is very small. So this is it. This is, as Helen was talking, this is essentially a brain pacemaker, but for us, we're looking to make a brain pacemaker for mental health. So we have pacemakers if your heart is sick, we have pacemakers for movement disorders. There's about a third of people who don't respond to antidepressants or other medications for mental illness. We don't have devices for those, not yet. And that's what we're trying to change by building a device that's smaller than anything that's ever been used to stimulate the brain before. The idea is that by miniaturizing this with some of the technology I'll talk about that was funded with basic research from the Brain Initiative, we can make something small enough to fit within the thickness of the skull here, so that it doesn't involve any kind of brain surgery. It's about a 20-minute outpatient procedure, and from that point forward, we can stimulate the circuits in the brain and play the motifs or the patterns. that can help people recover from mental illness. In the case of depression, it's the executive function center. So if you know people with depression, one of the things that they really struggle with is like getting out of bed in the morning, like calling their friends, working out. It's not because they don't know that these are the things that they have to do. It's their brain is preventing them from being able to do it. It's just as biologically debilitating as having a broken leg and saying, why can't someone walk? It's invisible. And so the idea is that with technology like these, we could stimulate those parts of the brain, restore function in the circuits that are debilitated, and people can recover. It was very hard to get here, and we're not there yet. And so it starts actually, when I was training, I, like probably many people here, had family history of mental illness. And that was one of the reasons that drove me actually out of the humanities and into science. So I was trained as a physicist because I was like, stuff makes sense in physics, like equations and stuff. And then one day, as I was finishing my PhD, a professor talked about the brain as a circuit. And I thought, if we have the engineering skills to repair circuits in computers and phones, why can't we use those same skills to repair the circuits in our own minds? And that's a naive physicist talking, but that set me off on a journey to try to develop the technology, the interfaces. And this was back in 2012, and the idea of an engineer going into neuroscience was not commonplace. When I went to look for a faculty position after I finished my postdoc, there was 2 jobs in the country that listed neuroengineering. In 2013, the BRAIN Initiative started. And what the BRAIN Initiative did is it said that it's worth investing money in the tools and technologies to interface to the brain, that the science is important, but the science also needs tools. And then I had an opportunity to fund my lab, the work that I wanted to do. I wanted to be the person who could build that kind of interface. And so for over 10 years, we were very fortunate in getting BRAIN Initiative funding. And one of the things I wanted to do was to come up with a pacemaker design for the brain. And no offense, my friends from Medtronic, but I'm going to offend them now. I didn't want it to look like a pacemaker, right? It's like if you want to stimulate your heart, it makes sense to build a can with some wires that go in there. But if I want to stimulate the brain, that's probably not the form factor that I want. What do I want? Well, I want something without those wires if possible. But we didn't have the technology to do it because I needed energy. I needed energy in a very small form factor. So over 10 years, we invented a wireless power transfer technology that allowed us to miniaturize devices like these because it's the battery that takes up the big space. So we got rid of the batteries, replaced with the new technology. And I was super excited. Like, this was my moment. I'm a physicist, and I solved a physics problem to make something for the brain. And then I was like, what's next? And I remember sitting at home, and I got a call about, from one of my friends who had been part of a company called Neuralink, which you might have heard of and maybe work at. And he said, have you thought about spinning this out? And I was like, God, that would be the dream come true, right? Because as Representative Luttrell said, I didn't want this to end as a publication. I wanted this to become a device that would actually get into humans. But I didn't know how to do that. And I started talking to people, and I discovered, as Michael will probably mention, it is super expensive, about $150 million to take a prototype and get through a regulatory approval process. And some people spend a whole lot more than that. I had to go out to the venture community. And what I discovered was that because I had created a prototype in my lab, that I had IP, that I had first in human data, that it was funded by BRAIN Initiative, I was able to convince investors to take a risk on a new founder and a new startup and a new idea because we had already de-risked a lot of that work ahead of time. And as a result of that, we've been able, over the last 4 years, to raise about 35 million. So we're not quite all the way there yet, but we have a prototype like this that has gone through the manufacturing process. The company's based in Houston, Texas. We're building the devices there. We have 25 employees. We're waiting to hear back from FDA actually this week, looking to get approval to begin the clinical trial for the first device designed for mental health, implantable device. So it's been a long journey. John made it sound real easy, but it was very difficult. But I think it's an example of how that foundational support early on made it possible for us to take something from an idea and a hope and a dream into something that will be in patients by the end of the year.
Thanks, Jacob. We're so excited to start to really look at mental health in a different way, and you're helping us do that, so thank you. But, Jacob, you touched on a really important point, is that, the BRAIN Initiative funding helped to de-risk the technology so we can get it out to people. And I wanted to turn to Doug, because Doug is with another startup company. But Doug, you've have had a really interesting journey, if you will, having been in academia as a researcher, having been worked at a funding agency at one point, and now you're getting into startups, out into industry. So you've had a really interesting journey. And I'm sure Doug will describe this to us as like Jacob's company, Motif, your company, Reach Neuro, is also a startup company, but it's a little bit different because instead of using stimulation in the brain, you're discovering and developing minimally invasive spinal cord stimulation for rehabilitation, which is a whole new area. And you're focusing on stroke, as Congressman Latrell mentioned today. People who have stroke, it's once you have it and you're out of rehab, that's all you're going to get. But you're trying to change that. Can you tell us?
That's right. Thanks, Jen. So stroke is probably a condition that's familiar to many in the room. It's a condition that affects more than 7 million people just in the US, but in fact, the numbers globally are much larger. It's also a condition for which there is no cure. So if you suffer a stroke, you will likely be extremely paralyzed immediately after the stroke. If you're lucky, over the next 6 months, you'll recover some, but certainly not all of the function that you lost to the stroke. And after that, you're kind of stuck. And so for the patients we work with, they come to us and they say, you know what, I had my stroke 10 years ago, and since then I've had to live my life one-handed because my left arm just doesn't work. Or I can move it, but it just requires so much effort that I choose to do all of my activities with my so-called good arm. And so the technology that we developed, which was in many ways sort of accidental in the path that we got to developing the technology, but the way it works is it electrically stimulates not the motor pathways in the spinal cord, but the sensory pathways, which is a bit counterintuitive because paralysis is clearly a motor problem. But what we discovered through decades of fundamental research is that sensory inputs to the motor system play a critical role in shaping the activity of muscles. And it was in a project that was funded by DARPA and as well the NIH, where we were trying to stimulate sensory pathways to create illusions of touch and movement for amputees, that we discovered that when we did that, we actually produced effects in muscles as well. So in addition to creating this sensation of movement, we could actually produce movement itself. And so that led to a first-in-human study, first in amputees, where we were working with amputees to try to rebuild sensation of touch and movement in their missing limb. That worked well. It also showed us that those patients experienced activation of their muscles. That sent us in the direction of using that concept and that technology to create a new approach to treating people with paralysis due to stroke. And so 4 years ago, we got our first Brain Initiative grant to treat stroke. We just finished our first clinical trial of that technology. So we tested a total of 7 patients, all in this so-called chronic stage of their recovery. That is, they had experienced their stroke more than a year prior to beginning our study. All had given up hope on recovering arm and hand function because it had been so long. And in every one of those patients, we produced not only a significant improvement in their ability to use their arm and hand, but as well, many of those patients were able to come off of the anti-spasticity medication that they were taking to deal with their troubling spasticity. So here we have a technology that improves function, improves independence, but also alleviates the debilitating effects of spasticity. And so, one of the things that I want to emphasize is that, 20 years ago when I started the lab, I wasn't focused on creating a cure for stroke. I was really focused on understanding how the nervous system encodes information about movement and how that movement is controlled by the neural circuits of the brain and spinal cord. But along the way, we were challenged by national initiatives led by NIH and DARPA in many cases that forced us to think about applications of that knowledge and implementation of the technology that we were developing. And it is through that, those sort of national initiatives that we landed here. And so that's our story.
Thanks, Doug. But can you talk, it's an interesting journey that you've been on, right? From academia and now starting in a company. But can you talk a little bit about how the funding has helped you along the way and in this really complex ecosystem of going from a lab into a clinical trial and how that funding helped you to bring that forward?
Absolutely. So most of the funding, at least early on, was focused on science, right? Like understanding how the nervous system works, understanding the role of sensory pathways in shaping motor function. But then some of that funding was really focused on technology development, technology created for the purpose of restoring sensations to amputees or other things. And so that those diverse sources of funding advanced our science and advanced our technology to the point where we were eventually ready to make the transition into humans. And one of the special things that I think we're going to talk about in the BRAIN Initiative is that there was a critical focus on forging partnerships between university labs and industries like Medtronic and Precision and others, where for the first time we could work side by side with industry partners that had FDA-approved technology, which we knew was safe and effective in humans, but we could repurpose to do new things. And that was really a game changer for us and many others.
And can you talk just a little bit about the technology? Jacob mentioned this a little bit. You're looking at like almost a platform technology where you can start to address different neurological conditions. Can you talk a little bit about how spinal cord stimulation, I mean, I'm excited about it because it's going for spinal cord injury, but how it might be applied to different conditions as well? What you might
Indeed, spinal cord stimulation is a fairly old, mature technology. It was first approved for use in humans in 1987 to treat pain. Since then, it's been used for a number of things, including Parkinson's disease, including spinal cord injury. There's a company that is now looking at using spinal cord stimulation for managing blood pressure as well. And so in many ways, it is a platform technology. The spinal cord has, it supports a wide range of physiological functions in the body. In our case, we're targeting sensory motor circuits, but in others, we can target autonomic functions, for blood pressure and so on. So again, that's one of the advantages of a technology-based solution is that if you have a device that can be implanted easily in the body, and Jacob's device is a great example of that, Precision's device is another, where with that device, you can build your own therapy using that technology as a platform, simply by programming or creating motifs of stimulation that target the specific circuits that you're accessing.
Yeah, it's great. I mean, a couple of great points that I think we can touch on in a bit. One thing that strikes me is reminding us all the importance of understanding a basic mechanism. If we don't really understand to some degree how these circuits function normally, getting in there to try to intervene or fix them when, for example, after stroke or injury is going to be that much more difficult. The cool thing about this is, again, the platform technologies, they can be applied to many, many different conditions. We'll hear more about deep brain stimulation for other conditions and adaptive deep brain stimulation for other complex conditions. The interesting thing about the spinal cord stimulation is that similar type of stimulation has been used to help people recover from lower spinal cord injuries so they can actually walk. This is work done by Gregor Cortin in Switzerland also, but in collaboration with NIH researchers, in animal models, they identified the circuits that are being modulated and actually changing down to the cell types. And so what this gives us is information back into the lab to try to, in a virtuous cycle, improve this knowledge as well as technology. So this is really, really fascinating. And then Michael's company, Precision, is developing what we call a minimally invasive set of electrodes, instead of sticking these wires into the brain in this grisly way, a different way. And so Michael, talk about that. It's a bit of a gear switch for us, because here we heard about neuromodulation, but here you're in a space what we call brain-computer interface, being able to use to record, read out the activity of neurons in the brain, to interpret it with very sophisticated AI approaches, to drive what we call neural prosthetics, either to move a limb, or to restore sensory function, or to allow paralyzed individuals who cannot speak to actually literally speak through a synthesizer. So Michael, tell us about what you're up to in precision, and what are the barriers that you can overcome with this really cool device? And you have a little model of that too, right?
Yeah, I'll share mine.
Thanks.
Thanks for the question. So a little bit of background. Precision Neuroscience, I'm one of the co-founders and the CEO. We're developing a brain-computer interface, which enables people to control computers and other digital devices just with their thoughts. The company has raised $180 million over the course of the past 5 years. We're almost exactly 5 years old. We're working in 16 of the leading hospitals across the country, Johns Hopkins and Penn Medicine and NYU and others in New York. We've implanted, as of this morning, 81 people with our technology. And we have an FDA clearance. We're the first BCI company with clearance for implantation up to 30 days.
Okay.
And that's how we've been able to sort of prove the function of the system in the early days. In terms of the device, how do we do it? It's this. I think it's hard to see probably from afar, but it's very thin. You'll have to take my word for it. It's a fifth of the width of a human hair. And this is a very, very thin, very soft and conformal device that sits on the surface of the brain without penetrating into the brain and without damaging the brain. And so it creates a high bandwidth link between the brain and outside compute without doing any sort of fundamental tissue damage. On this very thin film, we deposit over 1,000 tiny platinum electrodes. So the electrodes themselves are about 50 microns in diameter, so that's roughly the size of a neuron. So we're really speaking to the brain at its own natural scale. And in order to manufacture a system such as this very, very thin film with over 1,000 tiny sensors on it, we have borrowed manufacturing techniques from the semiconductor chip manufacturing industry. So we use photolithography to make the chips. That itself is new, and I think a lot of the fundamental foundational research in order to do this work was funded initially by DARPA and then by the Brain Initiative. But no supply chain has ever existed for this because it's never been done before. We've never had sort of biocompatible materials manufactured using photolithography in an FDA cleared device. And so we had to build a fab, which we now have in Texas, in order to manufacture these systems. In terms of what this enables, thought-based control of computers, it sounds like science fiction. But actually, there has been 20 years at this point of validation that again really was federally funded in its early history by DARPA and by the Brain Initiative in order to prove that this was possible, that you could effectively record the electrical activity from the brain. And even in someone who has had a spinal cord injury or who has a degenerative disease where the brain continues to function but the brain-body connection has been disrupted, that you can bypass the injury or the illness and you can use the signals from the brain to control a computer or a phone or another kind of digital device. I think for people who have lost the ability to use arms and hands, this really is going to be life-changing technology. If you think about someone who's paralyzed, from sort of a tetraplegic, so has no use of arms and hands, these are people who are generally homebound as a result of their disability. And on top of that, not being able to use a computer or another digital device means you're not just isolated physically, but you're isolated digitally. I mean, in 2026, it's very hard to be a citizen of the world without an ability to seamlessly operate these sorts of systems. So our goal is to enable people to live much higher quality of life, to enable communication and entertainment, and ultimately to enable people to go back to work if they choose. And so, taking someone who is necessarily dependent on the state and on most often family members, and enable them to go back to work and generate an income. And this is sort of maybe a non-obvious way that funding from government ends up paying itself back, enabling people to regain financial independence and become taxpayers again. I'm sure was not one of the initial intentions of the funding environment, but I think is one of the very happy and likely outcomes of it. I think in terms of sort of the system like a system like this, I think it's no surprise. It's really complex. It requires a great deal of cutting edge expertise in diverse sets of disciplines, from material science for the part of the system that actually is implanted and interfaces with the brain, very sophisticated electronics to process the signals that are coming off the brain, to amplify them, to digitize them. All it has to be very low power, and you have to be very sensitive to temperature when you're implanting something in the body. And then, incredibly sophisticated computer algorithms in order to take the billions of data points per patient per minute. That's what we're collecting, and to make sense of it and to use it to drive a function. That is both, sort of technically very complex, and it's very capital intensive. And you can't raise money, as Jacob was mentioning, you can't go to investors and say, I think this might work. You can't say, we think it's possible to control a computer with one's thoughts, even though it's never been done before, and raise significant amounts of venture capital. That's not what private capital funds. What you can do is say, listen, this has worked in academic prototypes. The proof of concept has now been established, and we need capital to take what is an N of one and basically make it manufacturable at scale and integrate all of these diverse components into a system that is able to perform at super high rates of reliability and performance. Those are engineering challenges. They're not easy, but you can convince investors that is a tractable problem, and as long as there's an opportunity to do something really big, you can inspire people to want to participate. So I think this is just an example of how some of the sort of foundational work that is enabled by funding such as the Brain Initiative really helps create whole new industries and whole new areas of science and medicine that wouldn't exist without it.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I can tell you that when there was talk about this thing called the Brain Initiative starting in about 2011, 2012, I remember convening a group of scientists and engineers at UC Berkeley, UCSF, and Lawrence Berkeley National Labs. And there, the somewhat pedestrian question is, could anybody make an electrode array of the sort you have today, right? Of the density, whatever properties, and the best engineers were kind of saying, well, maybe, and they went through all these calculations, and it wasn't quite clear. But what's really breathtaking to me is how folks were able to make the impossible possible. I mean, it's just an engineering problem, we say, but it's more than just that. The other piece of this is this idea that one can record from not that many neurons in the brain and drive a speech synthesizer that allows somebody to communicate through this machine where they otherwise couldn't, was literally science fiction 10 years ago. I remember that, so the Brain Initiative started as a collaboration between jointly supported by NIH, NSF, and DARPA. And DARPA, of course, is the one entity that takes the big, crazy risk. And I remember the subnets program, where the idea was to use DBS, deep brain stimulation, to help veterans who are living with PTSD. And a couple of my colleagues got one of those grants, and I looked at them and said, you're out of your minds. This will never work. And here we are, about a decade later, and it's actually working, it's being deployed. So the question I have for Helen and also Rob is, what are the next mountains to climb? And what's really cool is that DBS isn't being used just for motor disorders, but also for many, many other indications. It also gets toward platform technologies. What have you learned through all these journeys establishing technology for this space? How are you applying it to these other indications that are afflicting so many different lives? I'd like to hear both of your perspectives on that.
So I'll start off. I think we're just at the beginning. I think listening to what everybody's saying is you have an idea and you think it's crazy. I remember when we implanted the first sensing neurostimulator. So remember, cardiac pacemakers have been sensing for a long time. This was a big deal to have a device. We did most of our recording trying to understand how the brain controls movement in the operating room. After we finished doing the microelectrode recording, planting the leads, then we get a short amount of time where we'd have externalized leads and we try and do some experiments. The operating room is not really a great place to do research. So with this completely transformed my research because I'd already developed these quantitative ways of measuring movement, highly precise, highly engineered. And now I could actually record the brain signals directly from the device. And so I did, in my primate work, I would train a monkey to do eye movements. It would take me 6 months. But I could ask a human to do very complex movements, and I could record the brain signals and the kinematics because I had them together. And that really was, I think, one of the reasons why Medtronic was interested in us being part of this brain radio project. And that really set us off. We discovered so many things doing this. So I think the groups across the world, we've started off with something called the beta oscillopathy. So a disorder of neuronal oscillations in a certain frequency range is paramount in Parkinson's disease. It's a property of the sensory motor network. And we can basically lift off this abnormal processing with deep brain stimulation. And now that's really the signal that we use to drive adaptive deep brain stimulation. So along the way, we were all recording these signals, and to get rid of the noise, you had to record for at least 60, maybe 90 seconds, and you'd then get this average signal, and that's what we would use to measure power. There's a very preeminent neuroscientist called Anne Graybiel who was sitting beside me at the first Opto-DBS meeting in Geneva, and she said, I think you guys have got this whole thing wrong by averaging this signal, because I can see this beta rhythm in normal primates. We all have beta rhythm in our brains. It's not abnormal, and this was a huge debate. Why are you calling this abnormal? We all have beta. She said, I see this occurring in these little bursts that last about 40 to 120 milliseconds, and I think what's going wrong in people with Parkinson's disease is those bursts are too long. They're still bursting, but they're too long. So a bunch of us went back and we looked at our data, and sure enough, instead of 40 to 120 milliseconds, our bursts in people with Parkinson's were lasting for a second or a second and a half. So all of a sudden, that led us to new signals, new algorithms. And I love this, this partnership, because what would happen is we'd push the science further forward. And I think I'm actually still called the pest from the West in Medtronic. And I go back to Medtronic and say, well, we need something better. And so would some of my colleagues at other universities. So Medtronic came up with actually another investigative neurostimulator where we could actually now write even more complex algorithms that would then allow us to measure these beta band burst durations and literally truncate them. So we wouldn't get rid of the good beta, we'd just get rid of the bad beta, put it that way. And we had a Brain Initiative grant, thank you very much. And we use these more sophisticated algorithms to focus on a really terrible problem in Parkinson's called gait impairment and freezing of gait. And that was something that some people think deep brain stimulation doesn't help at all. It actually does. And we could use these more sophisticated technology, the knowledge that we had, to actually push the field a little further forward. And then we did another thing that was fairly radical, is we had wearables on. So wearables are things that measure your movement. And we put 11 of them on the body. And we actually used those signals with a PC in the loop to write other algorithms where we drove it just with tremor to start with, and we controlled tremor. We drove it with signals from the legs with walking. So that has never been done before either. So looking forward, we've also seen in our research that there's something called cross-frequency coupling. So some rhythms can carry other rhythms. There's a much more complicated set of signals in the brain that currently we don't have the technology, and I'm talking to Rob here, to do this online in real time. This is asking him to do that.
He's nodding.
I understand.
What I wish for, I may get. But this is where we're going to go. And then, as many of our speakers are talking about, they're developing these really very cool devices to get to neuropsychiatric syndromes, and it's really moving quickly. But how about if we could close that loop? How about if we could now also do that for neuropsychiatric diseases with theta rhythms and the different types of rhythms? Recording from the cortex is an awful lot easier than recording from where I record, so these signals are easier. But I'll stop there. But you've got the science pushing forward, technology moves forward, then we get more discovery and more results, and now we have more indications.
So, Rob, tell us about all these, Helen and all these other researchers that are pestering you to develop new technologies that would work better for the indications. I imagine you and your company do have interest in this.
The struggle is real.
Yeah.
Getting back to context here, it was a crazy idea less than 10 years ago that you could record brain signals chronically in people in the real world circumstances. That had never been done. And so talk about risk. And then even crazier to say that we will use that information to automate a therapy. So we've done that. Now, next frontiers, that's just one part of the therapy for Parkinson's. Parkinson's is really a spectrum disorder. They suffer from multitudes of symptoms. It's, you'll hear if you've seen one Parkinson's patient, you've seen one Parkinson's patient. They have non-motor symptoms, they have sleep disorders. And so we're just starting to crack the code because now we have a window into the brain, right? So that's Parkinson's. Now, as Helen alluded to, we have a platform technology. It's called Percept, and that is implanted in other types of patients. So we have approved indications for epilepsy, dystonia, essential tremor, as well as investigational studies in treatment-resistant depression, Tourette's, and we are learning light years fast compared to what we were doing in the old days with the brain radio device that would get you snippets. Now we can record 24/7, and we're developing a digital health infrastructure that then will allow us to be cloud connected and really record this information in real time and understand what is happening on a patient's daily. And I'll just give you some examples. In epilepsy is a different scenario. So Parkinson's, you provide the stimulation therapy and you'll see the effects in real time for the tremor, the bradykinesia pretty quickly. And something like an epilepsy or a dystonia, it takes weeks, months, or even longer to see the therapeutic effects. And we're dealing with a black box. Now we have feedback, and we can actually listen to the brain and dial that dose in, just like you would do with a drug, right? Titrate that in. We have a partnership with Helen of the East, that is Helen Mayberg at Mount Sinai and Dr. Brian Capel.
And Helen West.
And we're working on treatment-resistant depression, and of course, invasiveness, and patient adoption is a thing, but we've been working with that team for now well over 10 years and chronically recording brain signals, and she's got publications showing we can identify when a patient's about to relapse before their clinical signs are occurring. So we're just on the cusp of this, and it's just the beginning. But again, it was founded on that ability to chronically record brain signals. These devices are expected to last decades in patient's body. You heard the congressman earlier, and now we actually have a window to monitor that and titrate it and personalize it.
And that is such an important point, is now we can really personalize these very complex neurological and psychiatric conditions, now that we can record from our nervous systems and be able to treat out and personalize it so that, we're not stimulating for the same person across a population. You're actually looking at an individual and seeing how they're reacting to their own condition.
And what you're seeing here is that not only that, but you're able to expand it to other disorders that we've never had access before, because we can learn the iterative cycle is so much faster now.
Exactly. And Helen and Rob, you have this beautiful relationship, right? Between a partnership between industry and academia. But, we mentioned that there's a whole ecosystem to be able to take a technology from the lab out into the marketplace so it can get into clinical practice. And so I have to ask kind of our startups over on the other side of the table there, is that, who are the other players in this ecosystem, and what's the importance that they play, and how are those partnerships that you're building, of which the Brain Initiative has been really a facilitator of some of those partnerships. Could you talk a little bit about who are the other players, like our regulators or payers or other people in the ecosystem, and how that plays towards you making the strive of bringing your technology to people in society? Michael, why don't you start us off?
Yeah, I'll mention sort of three different constituents which I think are critical to translating technology into clinical practice and impact. One is we work at academic hospitals across the country, as I mentioned before. Incredibly important to have that ecosystem where you can really translate this cutting edge technology and get it out into the world. Our regulator in the FDA, I think we're very lucky to have an incredibly sophisticated and expert FDA in the United States. I think it's actually one of our competitive strengths that the folks who are regulating us are themselves PhDs in areas related to the technology that we're developing, and many of them worked within the context of Brain Initiative grants. And I think that's part of why, for brain-computer interfaces specifically, for I think neurotech more generally, the United States still has a lead. Yeah. And I think the third is the payers, and that's private insurance, and then that's Medicare and Medicaid. I think there's some work to do. I think we can really make a lot of progress relative to where we are today in terms of providing clarity around what device manufacturers will get paid to create a clear market signal that unlocks funding. It's sort of an insane system, but on average, there is a several-year gap between FDA approval and CMS reimbursement. And if you think about what that means that the devices that have been deemed to go through the process and be both safe and effective don't get to patients. And they don't get to patients because there's no clarity around what the companies or the physicians who implant them are going to get paid. And that's just no one would design a system where there's a completely different regime between regulatory approval and payment if you were doing it from scratch. This is just the way our system has evolved. And so I think that one of the things that we can do, in addition to continuing to fund basic research in the United States, is also create a much more efficient and logical pathway for companies that are trying to deliver cutting edge technologies to areas of medicine that right now have very little or even nothing. And in a way that doesn't cost anything, it just provides clarity much sooner than it's done today. And by the way, that is happening in other places across the world that see the lead that the United States has in neurotechnology and in BCI, and is trying to emulate some of the things that we've done right, and also correct some of the mistakes that we've made along the way. And so I think that hopefully is additive incentive for us to get our acts together.
If I could just quickly underscore the comment about the FDA. I think for many years, the FDA was seen as a barrier to innovation. But since the launch of the Brain Initiative and in partnership with a lot of DARPA's efforts in this space, they've really become a partner for innovation. Working side by side with program managers at NIH and DARPA to spearhead initiatives to advance neurotechnology, mainly into the clinical stages of use. So.
Right. I mean, NIH wound up being the lead agency of the U.S. Brain Initiative, but the U.S. Brain Initiative it comprises 5 U.S. federal agencies, including the FDA, and this was recognized as being critical because, as has been said here a couple of times, many times, that it's great to have an invention, but if you can't get it into people, it's kind of you've kind of missed the target. Doug, I would say you're kind of a parallel entrepreneur. You're involved in another company called Synchron. One thing that's kind of interesting is my perception of the field, for what it's worth, is that in order to really disseminate these technologies more broadly, a barrier is the invasiveness. The barrier is needing a surgeon to go in and literally place electrodes deep in the brain. But minimally invasive approaches, I think, are going to ultimately be the one of the solutions to that barrier. Tell us a little bit about Synchron and that journey.
Sure. So Synchron is another brain-computer interface technology. They were founded initially in Melbourne, Australia, by a couple of young neuroscientists, well, one engineer, one neurologist, that had this crazy idea to record brain signals from inside a blood vessel in the brain. So by taking a traditional endovascular stent and equipping it with sensors that they could then deliver to the brain through a catheter, they had this vision of creating an intracranial brain sensor without the need, without requiring an open, skull surgery, right? So without cracking the skull, we can now record directly from inside the brain. Well, back in 2011, that idea was too crazy to get funding from NIH and any other funding agency, but DARPA was the one agency willing to roll the dice and support that initial work. And then within 5 years of that initial award, they had demonstrated in animals that the idea was actually sound. Within 5 years of that initial work, they were in humans in a Melbourne-based trial, demonstrating in 4 patients with ALS that the technology is both safe and effective. But in spite of all of that, progress, which took place over the course of less than a decade, they were still having a difficult time raising funding from the venture capital industry. Whether it's coincidental or not, I don't think it is. Within months of receiving an award from the NIH Brain Initiative and breakthrough device designation from the US FDA, they landed their first major capital investment. So these agencies, not only do they play a critical role in supporting the work that we do every day, but they're also seen as a trusted partner and a trusted evaluator of emerging technology. So getting the seal of approval of the FDA and getting the seal of approval of the NIH is absolutely critical, especially for early stage companies like the ones.
And it wasn't just money. I think Synchron also managed to forge a partnership with one of the major AI companies as well. Yeah.
Multiple.
Yeah, multiple. Yeah. So it's generative, I guess is the point. Yeah.
Indeed.
But I think that the one thing that has been mentioned more than once, and you brought it up, Doug, is about our global partners and our international partners and how important they are. But, Jacob, maybe you can touch on the importance of our international partnerships, but also keeping our international competitiveness as in the American spirit and entrepreneurialism. So if you can just touch on that.
Yeah, certainly. And maybe I'll do that because I wanted to dovetail into something that Michael talked about in terms of stakeholders. Because the stakeholder community that we have here is different than the stakeholder community that our competitors and collaborators have internationally. In addition to what Michael brought up, I think people to consider when we're thinking about taking an idea and then getting it into patients are people with lived experience. I learned this actually from you, Jen, so thank you. But this is really important for companies like mine where we're dealing with something like mental health. Right? It's like it's invisible. And so, one, how can we communicate the need for this to other people? I mean, we probably all have personal experiences, but having someone that has lived what it's like to have treatment-resistant depression can communicate the statistics that we lose more lives to suicide than we do to car accidents every year. Yeah. And yet, we don't have the same concerted effort to make driving safety safer that we do for mental health. So those people are really important here, and partly it's because we have such a fragmented regulatory reimbursement and healthcare system. I think that was the other point I wanted to bring up to Michael. So in addition to the FDA and the payers, we also have the hospital providers. And it's possible for us to come out with a technology that gets approved by the FDA, safe and effective. We then go to an insurance company and they have to decide, is this actually going to save the insurance company money? And even if that happens, if there's some doctor in the whole system that might be making a little bit less money by prescribing a neurotechnology over a pharmaceutical, they're disincentivized. And this brings me to the stakeholder of government. I think this is where government can help to streamline that process. Look, if we're building something that's going to make people's lives better, that is going to bring down total cost of care over a period of time, there's absolutely no reason why we should keep that out of the hands of patients, and yet we do time and time again because there's going to be one stakeholder in that chain that's disincentivized. This problem is not true in some of our foreign competitors. They can, from the top down, declare something as a national priority and streamline the entire system and support the science, the clinical trials, and the commercialization. And what does that do? That gives those foreign jurisdictions the opportunity to bring those technologies out first and faster. It allows them to collect the data that we believe is going to be so important for unlocking a lot of these platform capabilities. So I think we run the risk of ceding ground to competitors that can get these devices out and collect data from them more quickly to make better therapies. So it's not only that we're losing ground to them, but like we're held back in creating better therapies for others. I think there's opportunities to work collaboratively with foreign governments. We've done that as well. We've had good relationships with the UK, who's funded some of this work. We now have a subsidiary in the UK. But I think my biggest concern is about being held back by this fragmented regulatory payment and healthcare system.
Yeah, we take this very seriously. We've actually been working to try to identify solutions to these pinch points. I was also over the UK. They set up a parallel ARPA-like program involving neurotech, really nice stuff. But I had to tell you, you guys are doing it better over here. So, our goal is to make sure we can keep it up. I mean, look, these aren't just US problems. These aren't just Europe's problems. These aren't just Asia's problems. These are human problems. And I think it will take ultimately a global village, but I also believe that the ingenuity, the entrepreneurial spirit in the US with our funding structure, NIH is still the largest funder of biomedical research in the world. This is what keeps me, my staff, everybody at NIH motivated to keep going, to make these, impossible types of problems be solved in our lifetime. So we really do appreciate that. I want to thank you all for being here, for your attention, for our incredible panelists. It really is humbling to hear about not just the science, but how it's done, the thought processes. So I really thank you for that. I hope you can agree. I hope you agree with me that we've really just seen some amazing stories that really represent the entire spectrum, from early discovery, from animal models to the early idea, the engineering challenges, overcome the engineering challenges, to getting into humans safely and responsibly, and then to get into the clinic to lift the entire ecosystem. So we're really quite impressed and grateful for all the work that you all do. It really keeps us motivated at the NIH. And I think it really does speak to the entrepreneurship, sounds corny, but the American way. It really is something that others are trying to emulate. And we are grateful for support from Congress, from the public, to get this work done. And I think everybody will see the benefits of these technologies, from early discovery again to getting it over the finish line. So thank you again for all that you do, for being here, and I'll hand it over to Jen for the final closing remarks.
Thank you, John. And again, we want to thank you all for attending. And as we conclude, we also want to extend our deepest appreciation for the Congressional Neuroscience Caucus, as well as the leadership that they've provided here on the Hill, and also their steadfast support for the BRAIN initiative. And we also want to extend our appreciation to our sponsors for making this event possible today. I think as we think about this, the sustained and strengthened investment that we have in this vital interagency program of the BRAIN initiative will really accelerate our understanding of the brain and the central nervous system. As you've heard today, it's going to unlock pathways of how we better diagnose conditions, including mental health that we mentioned today, but also complex other neurological conditions. And they're going to move us closer to prevention of these conditions like Alzheimer's disease going forward. So I hope that you realize the importance of this program, and also the medical technologies that you saw today that were only once an idea, and that were supported and taken a risk by the BRAIN initiative to be able to support and bring it forward. This program brings on a new generation of American innovation, and I hope we showcase that to you today. It's driving innovation and startups that are fueling our ecosystem in the business startup world. And it's also reinforcing our leadership in the global biomedical economy. So continued federal support ensures that these scientific, economic, and patient-centered benefits remain anchored here at home. And we respectfully urge Congress to provide the strongest possible funding for the BRAIN initiative. As we know, the 21st Century Cures Act is sunsetting at the end of the year. So we please urge Congress to continue to support the BRAIN initiative as we go forward and really helping us to deliver these transformative discoveries. We're not there yet, right? So we still have a lot of work to do. So again, we urge the support. And so we want to thank you all for coming. We thank you for your time and commitment to this topic. And please feel free to come up and look at some of our technologies that they're showcasing today. So thank you so much.